Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, slicers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And as promised, I'm going to do a video about the idea that a lot of people who support Trump could end up being disappointed. And there's a lot of evidence of that already. I did the notes for this video probably a month ago, and a lot of things I'm going to talk about are already happening. And I was predicting the fact that there's going to be a lot of turnover. I think there's, boy, dramatically, we're already seeing a lot of turnover in the Trump administration, and that's going to be part of what makes this complicated. One of the things that the people need to keep in mind, particularly the liberal base, because they seem to discuss the GOP as some kind of monolith, and it really isn't the case, because what we have is that not only is Trump being confronted by the status quo Democrats, but he's also being confronted by the status quo GOP. And so there's this dynamic and the struggle going on as far as the Trump administration is going on between a base that was looking for more independent policies, independent conservative policies, and then the traditional status quo GOP base that also has its own interests. And then, like I discussed previously, we have the fact that a lot of the appointments that Trump has made could blow up in his face, and we're seeing that now. The idea that people like Rick Perry can be put in charge of an agency he once discussed liquidating, and also at one point couldn't even remember. So we have the potential for a lot of these controversial appointments to blow up in Trump's face, and that's going to cause a lot of controversy for both the status quo GOP and the so-called alt-right. But we also have an article I've attached below that talks about the idea that disillusionment could be quick, and it could be bitter and nasty too. Um, as Hillary and Trump have both pointed out, a segment of the Trump base has a potential volatility, and this could end up flaring up, particularly in this current environment. And we'll see all kinds of different interpretations of what the present state of the GOP is. But the liberals cut Obama a lot of slack, and conservatives cut Bush a lot of slack, and then liberals cut Clinton a lot of slack, and then conservatives cut Reagan a lot of slack. And that's just how it goes. One's a Nazi, one's a commie, one's a Nazi, one's a commie. And so that kind of rhetoric will continue to show up now, and we'll see if even the conservative base starts throwing around these ideas. But all these different presidential archetypes, uh, like we talked about previously, work really well. If you're kind of an aw shuck sort of guy like Bush, then you have a lot of appeal with the GOP base. And if you're kind of a hip, young, intellectual type, then you are going to have a lot of appeal to the liberal base, and those archetypes really work. And these concepts go back and forth, get traded back and forth by different bases. We have a part of the GOP that was all not my president. They part of the GOP base was not my president when Obama got elected to a degree, and then people forget also that there was a never Trump uh, movement as part of the GOP when Trump was running just to get the nomination. So once again, to talk about the GOP as if it's a monolith, it's easy to see that there's going to be a split, and that certain portions of the GOP are going to be happy with developments that go on under Trump, and some will not. And so it'll be with the fringe elements that there could be a backlash. And what we're seeing already too is Trump already moving to the center on a lot of issues, and finding out what is going on in the real world. And I know there's a talk now that the deep state is reacting, and that's one of the things I find the most interesting going on right now. Particularly a lot of the liberal base out there that I've seen seems to act like the deep state takes 8 years off under Obama, and the deep state existed under Bush and now exists again under Trump. And somehow the oligarchy isn't in charge and takes time off. I don't know how that works. From what I can tell, the oligarchy and the deep state exists continuously, and that's something everyone needs to keep in mind. But in politics, there's a lot of bait and switch. There's a lot of salesmanship, and there's a lot of showmanship, and we got a lot of that with Trump, and we continue to. And so there's going to be a lot of disappointment and/or fuel for the fire, depending on which base you're part of. Seeing all these same tactics being played out and the confusion it causes in both bases. And then Jim Quinn talks about the fact too that we have a lot of things coming up that could potentially undermine the Trump administration and could be fairly dramatic. And I agree with that. In a lot of ways, it seems like Trump could be being set up to have the system finally fail. The economic system and problems in the world, in the financial system and the central banks has just been kicking the can down the road for quite some time. And now we have the potentiality that under the Trump administration, it will be time to pay the piper. And if that happens, then Trump could end up being the fall guy and for the entire system unraveling. And there's a lot of ways I halfway expect that. But Jim Quinn wrote a great article attached below that talks about the fact that the national debt, of course, keeps rising. The Fed could continue to raise rates because, if nothing else, the Trump bump economically that's going on could end up creating more interest rates hikes, which could potentially wreak a lot of havoc. But that's something I've gone into a lot more in other videos. Housing sales and prices are falling 5 to 20% in certain markets, so the housing market's topped, and we could see a backlash against that. And that includes the retail contraction with malls collapsing, and Sears and J.C. Penney's and a lot of these anchor stores, Macy's and Kohl's, all going bankrupt or doing mass layoffs. And we continue to see mass layoffs around the globe as well. Interesting to see all these promises of hiring when most of what we see continues to be more layoffs. Oil's back up to $60, and then it's going to go back down to 40, and there's an oil glut. So it seems like there's not going to be a huge rise in oil prices anytime soon, which also is going to eventually wreak continued economic havoc. There is no jobs recovery per se, and what little there was seems to be collapsing. So we'll continue to see that under the Trump administration. We'll continue to see deterioration in the EU, which will have its repercussions in the U.S. under Trump. The dollar continues to be strong for now, and but there's predictions that at some point the market has to have a huge correction, and Jim Quinn talks about the idea of a 50% sell-off in the market, and so that could be a very dramatic event under Trump, and once again he could end up being the fall guy for this, and all of those happening under a Trump administration could really have a lot of disillusionment for the base that supported him, particularly if his policies aren't effective in addressing these issues. But there's a lot out there, and a lot of it was pushed down the road, kicked the can down the road during the Obama administration, and sooner or later a lot of this economic fundamentals that are so rotten out there could collapse, and we could see the second leg drop. And like I say, if that happens under the Trump administration, then there's going to be a lot of repercussions from all bases. And then also we have predictions from Harry Dent. He talks about the idea that the Dow will continue to go up. And this is why I bring up these different viewpoints, because, for example, Jim Quinn and Harry Dent are at odds in some of their ideas. So obviously there's a good amount of thought going in both directions. He's talking about the idea that Harry Dent, that the Dow will continue to go up and we'll not see this huge correction, and that oil prices will rise, gold prices will sink, and the dollar will strengthen, and that a lot of the Trump agenda won't even pass. And that's a distinct possibility. I know people are pretty much up in arms right now about all these executive orders, but when you get right down to it, Trump has really not done that much yet, and there's not that much legislation so far, solid legislation, and we'll see a lot if a lot of it gets passed or not. Let's remember, he doesn't have a lot of support amongst the status quo GOP or the status quo Democrats, so he's going to have a hard time taking any kind of independent tack if that's what he had in mind. Harry Dent also talks about a 10% summer rally, and then maybe in the fall a 40% crash in the market. So we got a couple of predictions of the idea that there might be a huge crash in the market at some point, a huge correction. So once again, we get the idea that there's going to be a huge transition under Trump, and that he could be bearing the brunt of the repercussions of this last shakedown in the economy, global economy. And then let's look at the whole Trump so-called Republican agenda that's going on right now, tit for tat. So of course, right off the bat, we have the idea that Obamacare is going to be replaced and repealed, and we're already seeing a little backpedaling on that. And so once again, we're going to see the GOP base and the liberal base reacting differently to these developments depending on what Trump ends up coming up with. There seems to be a little more concern to take it a little more carefully now. This whole idea of Planned Parenthood is just something that gets kicked back and forth every time there's a new administration in office. And once again, just a certain amount of global funding is cut back, and most of it is symbolic, and so there's nothing really there. Then we have the border security and the talk about the wall, and we've had the border security and the wall be an issue with both liberal and conservative administrations back and forth. People have short memories, but it's very well documented that depending on who's talking about it, somehow it becomes more vilified. But in this case, we'll see if the border security and the wall ends up being a lot more moderate project, in which case a lot of Trump supporters may end up being disappointed in that. The Supreme Court nominations could end up being a little more restrained than a lot of GOP supporters would like. There's probably not going to be any repeal of abortion rights anytime soon. So that's an issue that could end up dividing the GOP base, depending how far, how much they want actual conservative activist judges and how more moderate ones that Trump may end up picking. We shall see. The whole thing about NAFTA, once again, it's a very symbolic. There isn't any really drastic changes going on right now. It's just a symbolic gesture, but that's another issue that could end up being something the GOP is disappointed in, because the reality sets in about the relationship, for example, between the United States auto industry and the U.S. auto industry represented in Mexico. That's going to be hard to separate out and have any real renegotiations of NAFTA. And then we have this whole thing with Iran. Once again, that's something that the GOP base is kind of split on. Some feel very strongly that we need to have more sanctions and cancel any treaties with Iran and actually go to war with them. And then another part of the base wants a more non-interventionist policy. And so it could go, once again, it could go either way with that. And we're already seeing what's going on with immigration. We're having a little backpedaling going on in immigration in the Trump administration. Once again, part of the GOP base is going to be pleased with it. The liberal base, of course, is against anything, even though, once again, if you go back to previous administrations, we had variations on these same policies that the liberals supported at that time, but it's very easy to vilify any new introductions in partisan battles that go on. And then we have deregulation going on, and a certain amount of deregulation is going to be an easy target for liberals to attack the Trump administration. But there's going to be a certain amount of GOP that will also may or may not be happy with some of the legislation we end up coming up with. So a lot of this, it's too early to tell. I know there's talk about impeachment, and what a horrible administration is, but I haven't really seen much actual legislation yet, so it's really too early to tell what's going to happen. So a lot of this we just have to guess. Offshore drilling, the Obama administration was for the XL pipeline, and now we have Trump pushing for it, and then also the energy policies and climate change policies. Once again, it will be interesting to see how they develop under the Trump administration. I see generally we'll probably have a continuation of policies that we've seen in the previous administrations. Guantanamo obviously didn't close during the Obama administration, and potentially will be reopened, or I shouldn't say reopened, continuing to be used and maybe expanded. I know that the money was already appropriated by the Obama administration to expand Guantanamo, so that's already baked in the cake. We still see Venezuela continuing to be demonized by the GOP status quo, and we'll see how the Trump administration probably is just going to sit back and wait and watch and see what happens in Venezuela, just as the Obama administration did before that. And then, of course, we have the GOP base is split on Russia sanctions. Part of the GOP, the alt-right, doesn't view Russia as an enemy and thinks we should dismantle this new Cold War. But part of the GOP, of course, is aligned with the military-industrial complex and wants more cash rolling in and wants to keep hyping the Russia menace and continue sanctions and continue to sell weapons around the world. And then we have a GOP split on the drug price negotiations as part of a new Obamacare system. And I can't even imagine that anyone would be split on the idea of negotiating drug prices and using generics. But once again, that's going to be something that's going to be dividing the GOP base as well as pitting the GOP against the liberals. And then we have torture being reintroduced apparently under the Trump administration, or at least that's been the discussion. And once again, there'll be a split in the GOP, status quo GOP, and the government and the base on whether torture is legitimate or not. So all these things are going to be splitting the GOP down the middle. So I think it's not only important for the GOP base to keep this in mind, but very important for the liberal base to keep in mind that when they're talking about the GOP, there's a couple of different GOPs now. And like I say, I think a lot of people that supported Trump are going to be severely disappointed as he moves more and more to the right. And we're already seeing that with a discussion of more classic Project for the New American Century neoconservative warmonger policies that we saw during the Bush administration and extended in the Obama administration. And in spite of the campaign rhetoric, we're seeing that Trump is kind of moving in that direction as well. And so that's an unfortunate development. Once again, it's going to split the GOP base down the middle. And one of the things that we know that is going to severely disappoint a lot of people that supported Trump as an alternative to the so-called establishment and the so-called status quo is that the bottom line is Trump is not going to confront Wall Street. In fact, he's coddling them now. Trump is not confronting the transnationals. He's coddling them now. Trump is not going to challenge the military-industrial complex. He's coddling them now. Trump is not going to challenge the billionaires and the world elites and oligarchy. Instead, he's going to coddle them. And instead of challenging the Israeli lobby, he's going to coddle them. And instead of talking about automation, he's still talking about archaic ideas that China's stealing jobs when the entire world is moving towards automation. And that's there's going to be a lot more job losses due to automation. So on the one hand, Trump supports automation, but on the other hand, he wants to save American jobs, and he's not going to be able to necessarily do both. And then it looks like Trump's going to continue the cheap money policy, which is going to continue to build these bubbles in the economy around the globe, and they could blow up on his watch, like I say, which could blow up in his face. But in the meantime, certainly he's not challenging any of the central bank status quo. So there we have it. A lot of reasons why the GOP base, a lot of people that supported Trump could end up sorely disappointed. So who knows? Maybe his policies will be such that the liberal base ends up being happy with him. Nah, that's not going to happen. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.